Good afternoon, everybody. We've got people joining us. There might be a few more to join us over the next couple of minutes, but I think let's make a start. My name is Warren Cann and I'm hosting the webinar today. I'm a psychologist and the CEO of the Parenting Research Centre. I'm also joined by Kim Campbell, who's producing this webinar today. You'll see Kim in the chat room. And she's going to be helping us out as we work through our program today. Before I make a start, I would just like to recognise that even though we're meeting in cyberspace, we're looking at screens somewhere from chairs which are connected to the ground at some point, and that ground has traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, of those traditional owners from wherever you happen to be sitting and where we're sitting here in Melbourne today. This webinar is brought to you by the Government of Western Australia and the Department of Communities, and it's been lovely working with the Centre of Parenting Excellence in delivering a number of training programs which have included 4 workshops conducted in Perth and also 4 webinars, of which this is the 3rd. This webinar is a brief version of the same topic that I did in Perth a few weeks ago, and this is an efficient version of that, brought to you via webinar. And we thought it was important when we were planning this program of professional development to offer webinars so that those who could not make the face-to-face workshops would get access to the content. A little bit of webinar housekeeping before we get into our content. The first thing I wanted just to alert you to is that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared with participants, and you're more than welcome to share it with colleagues and other people, but I just wanted you to know that we are being recorded. Secondly, you'll see in the corner of the screen the chat facility, and you're more than welcome to use that facility to ask questions, to talk with each other, to make comments. Kim will also be in the chat room, and we'll be looking out to help anybody out if you need something or have a question. There's a limit to how much technical assistance we can provide, but we may be able to help you. So if you have an issue at your end, drop Kim a line. Kim will also be collecting some of those questions. I have a bit of a look during the webinar, but Kim will also be collecting those, and we are aiming to leave some time at the end to answer questions. So if a question occurs to you, why not whack it in the chat room, and then it will get onto the list. I've just a couple of questions. One thing that will happen when we finish the webinar is that pop like magic on your screen will be an online feedback form, and we would really appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete that form before you finish today. That information provides really valuable input that will help us improve this offering in the future. Webinars are still relatively new for us, so any feedback that you can give us about how we went would be gratefully received. Finally, in relation to technology, this particular platform seems to work best on computers. If you are on a iOS device, for example, such as an iPad or a phone, you may not be able to access all of the features. I don't think it'll make much difference in this particular program, but it's just something that we just wanted to apologise for in advance. The software isn't really that great at going right across all the different ways that we can now access the internet. When we're talking in cyberspace, it can be a bit mysterious, can't it? Who's in the room? Who are you joining here? So why don't we just take a couple of minutes to learn about our participants. I wonder whether you could just take a moment to complete our poll here and just indicate what your role is for us. Are you an educator? Are you a manager? Are you a policy? That's supposed to say policy maker. Oops. Not a poly maker, whatever that is. It sounds like more fun. Thank you. I can see you guys filling that out, and as you can see, we have a range of people joining us today. We have well, over a third are educators, so welcome, because this is really about working with parents in an early child education service. And clearly we have people who are involved in service management as well, and it's good. We have a number of policymakers here as well, so thank you for joining us. And to others as well, you're all very welcome. We have designed this content specifically though with the early childhood education and care sector in mind. So whether or not you're an actual practitioner in the field, or whether or not you're involved in supervising or supporting practice, or whether you're involved in managing services, or even thinking about the broader policy, we hope you find this information useful and practical today. Thank you for doing that poll. Okay. All right, I'm going to assume that I don't really have to make the case for why parents are important. Anybody who knows something about child development will know that parents play an enormous role in their children's development and their well-being. After all, they're their child's first teacher. And the very unique and special emotional relationship that parents have with children means that parents are influential in their children's development and their well-being, and they remain influential right through a child's life, not just during childhood, but also into adulthood. That makes parents important people. And that's why governments are increasingly interested and concerned about finding effective ways of supporting parents. The other thing about parenting, though, of course, it's, as they say, one of the toughest jobs out. We don't come, as they say again, with the manuals all ready to go. We start a learning journey from the moment we have a baby. As learners, it's important that we think about where we get our information, advice and support from. And so one of the things that we've become interested in over the last couple of years is the potential of early childhood education and care for reaching out its influence beyond the walls of a service into the home. We're very interested in the idea of early childhood education and care being a source of support and useful information for parents. Just having a couple of little tech issues here, folks. Just bear with me while we work our way through this. We did some research here in Victoria just recently, which reinforced the potential value of this idea. This is research that comes from the Parenting Today in Victoria survey that surveyed over 2,000 parents and asked them a whole lot of questions about how they were faring, but it also asked questions about where they seek help from. And this is data related to parental help seeking from educators. And as you can see, parents frequently talk to educators about issues that concern them in relation to their child. And if you look at the 0 to 2 and the 3 to 5 year age bracket, which is kind of the early childhood space for us, you can see that well over half of all parents will at some point seek help or information from educators. And we also found that when parents do this, their response is generally a very positive one. And you can see from this graph, if you look at the bars, they represent the different age groups. So blue, again, is the young age group, and green is the 3 to 5 group. And you can see that in terms of feeling comfortable talking to educators, the vast majority strongly agree that they are comfortable approaching their educator. And it was also really, we were very encouraged to see that parents felt like they're involved and that they get to participate in decision making in relation to their child. And as you can see, also quite strongly satisfied with the communication they receive or the communication they have with their educators. And so our hunch has now been supported by research that parents find educators a non-stigmatizing, accessible and valuable source of information and support. And I think this creates a very interesting and potentially productive way to think about the way early childhood education could make a difference. I mean, up until fairly recently, we've tended to focus on the quality of early childhood education programs, the idea being if we can enhance the quality of the experience that children have in ECEC settings, then we're going to be enhancing children's development and well-being. And of course, that is absolutely right, and it makes a lot of sense that the policy focus has been very much on improving and strengthening early childhood education programs. But there's another possibility I think that's quite intriguing here, and that is the idea that early childhood education and care could potentially increase its impact on children by being more effective in the support it offers parents in their role as parents. And this is this sort of notion of beginning to broaden out our influence from just what happens within our four walls to potentially going broader than that and having a positive influence in the home environment. And I think there's something really worth pursuing here, that one way that we can increase our impact is by building on the potential of those really effective relationships that educators can have with parents to further develop parental confidence and capacity. This obviously has benefits for the program because good partnerships help early childhood education and care services provide good programs. But this idea of supporting parents in their role is another, I guess, string to your bow that could help you improve the impact of your programs and services. And it's not that we expect that early childhood education and care providers suddenly become parent educators or parenting educators, but we are really interested in exploring what a difference they could make if they were to be equipped to work effectively with parents. And we think there are probably two important parts of this process, or important parts of this. First, there's a question about how do you create a relational environment which is conducive to partnership and makes it easier for parents to approach educators, to communicate with them, to work with them collaboratively. And that's worth paying attention to. And another important element is how we have conversations with parents, how we work with them to support them with questions or issues that they have. And how do we do that effectively? And it's this part, what we call collaborative or constructive conversations with parents that I want to focus on particularly today. How can you make the most of the conversations you get to have with parents to ensure that those conversations result in enhanced confidence and skills in parents? And we think that there are three things needed for that. The first is a collaborative disposition. And what we mean by a collaborative disposition is a set of beliefs, ways of thinking, particularly about parents, which are necessary for effective collaboration. Next, we need a collaborative style or approach, which is referring to the way we behave towards, the way we interact with parents. And finally, we need, I believe, a collaborative skill set, which is a set of skills around communication and interaction that support partnership building and genuine collaboration in a child's best interests. And the good news is that what our research is showing, a lot of other research is showing, is that we have that in spades in early childhood education and care. And so now we have this opportunity to really leverage these skills to make a difference in children's lives by supporting parents. Okay, so let's begin by exploring a little bit about what makes up a collaborative disposition. What are the kinds of beliefs, assumptions that we need to have if we're going to work effectively with parents? So the first assumption that I would like to highlight is, and we like to say this, that parents are made, not born. And that's because parenting is essentially learned on the job. And this assumption is really critical to a collaborative relationship, because if we believe that parenting is hardwired, if we believe that you inherit your way of parenting from your own experience of being parented and this then is unmodifiable, then there is really little reason to be supporting parents in their role. So a foundational assumption is that parenting is learned, that parenting is learnable, and that parents are learners who are capable of developing their parenting skills. And this idea of parenting being something that can be deliberately developed and enhanced is really important to an underpinning assumption to collaboration. And I just wanted to emphasize that human parenting in particular it seems to be, even though it is influenced by lots of factors, is heavily influenced by the day-to-day experiences that we have with our children, and of course is potentially open to modification based on our exposure to information and support and changes, for example, in the way our culture and our society thinks about parenting. Another important assumption to make that underpins the collaborative approach is that good parenting comes in all shapes and sizes. One of the traps that we can fall into is the idea that parenting should fit a particular template. And particularly we can make that mistake if we think that our particular approach to parenting or a particular model of parenting stands for all. Well, somebody who's able to be truly collaborative is open to the idea that there are many ways of skinning a cat, that there are many ways of getting to the same outcome. And in fact, we should be focused more on the function of parenting behaviours more than the form of parenting behaviours. For example, there are lots of different ways of expressing affection. Those ways might vary by a person's culture, they might vary by a person's gender, but they can all achieve the same thing. They might look different, but they achieve the same thing, which is demonstrating warmth and acceptance. The collaborative practitioner is open to the idea and curious about the approach parents are taking and not automatically judgmental that their approach is different. Next, the collaborative practitioner does not believe that parents are to blame for all the problems and challenges that children experience. Parents are very sensitive to blame in our culture because they get a lot of it. And so they're very sensitive to professionals who they feel might be evaluating them negatively. And that is going to undermine collaboration in a really powerful way. So a collaborative practitioner does not believe parents are to blame. They understand that when children experience challenges or difficulties, there are often multiple causes or reasons for that. There are internal child-related reasons, for example, disability or temperament. There are also contextual factors that impact on children and families that can make parenting more challenging and can also make raising a child more difficult. And all of those factors can come together to result in children experiencing developmental issues. But it's simplistic to simply blame parents for those issues. In fact, we like to think of parents, they're a bit like penicillin. It's not the absence of penicillin that causes the infection, but certainly the penicillin itself can be an effective treatment of an infection. And similarly, working with parents can be often the most effective way of helping to address issues in child wellbeing and development. And here's an assumption that also stands you on good ground as well. Parents are doing their best. And even when you are exposed to parenting behaviour which is unconstructive or unhelpful or even damaging, it's not because parents don't care. It's not because they have a weak character or that they lack motivation. It's in 99.99% of cases, it'll be parents who are doing their best, often under very, very difficult circumstances. And so I think you're on safe ground to assume, even when a parent is struggling, that for whatever reason, this is their best at the moment. And our job is to help them move forward from what they're able to do to add additional parenting skills to their tool bag or to solve problems that they might not have been able to solve for themselves up until now. And finally, I just wanted to, well, at least in relation to parents, I just wanted to also emphasise that what research shows is that context does matter. Parents don't parent in a petri dish. It's the sort of way of thinking about parenting, which kind of is restricted to the kind of nuclear family, is not particularly helpful and not very accurate. And so the collaborative practitioner understands that parents are parenting in a context. And for example, when they have access to good personal and social support, parenting is a lot easier. When they're exposed to adversity, whether that be poverty or mental health issues or other forms of stress or difficulties, and that can impair their capacity to respond to their children in the way that even they would like. And so the collaborative practitioner takes a wide view and understands that this is not just about the individual, it's also about the context in which individuals live. All right, collaborative practitioners not only bring a sort of set of beliefs about parents to the table, they also bring a set of beliefs about collaboration. And I think one of the best ways to think about the collaborative process is this idea that parents should be thought of as part of the team. In fact, I like to think of it like this, that we should think of parents more as colleagues than as clients, more as colleagues than consumers. Parents have a different role, of course, than what an educator does. Parents have got a completely different function. But when we bring the role of parent and educator together, we can potentially meld a whole range of knowledge, skills and expertise that enable us to be more effective together than if we were to be working separately or individually. And so thinking about a parent as a member of the team who's jointly focused on enhancing a child's wellbeing, development and learning is a good starting point for developing a strong collaboration. Parents will sense the respect that you're offering them because you are treating them as you would a colleague. And also you are setting up the relationship so that you are going to be able to best benefit from accessing the parent's own skill, expertise and knowledge of their child, of their situation, of their culture, all of things which you won't have access to yourself. So collaboration really is about teamwork around the shared purpose of making a difference for a child. All right, so there's a range of, I guess, assumptions or beliefs that underpin a collaborative approach. Without those assumptions, it's difficult to approach parents openly and with the kind of curiosity and interest and respect that's really necessary for effective work with parents. So we need to cultivate and develop those attitudes as a basis of our work with parents. Let's now turn and have a talk about collaborative behaviour. And what I want to talk a little bit about here is what a collaborative style looks like. It turns out it's not just what we do that matters, it's also how we do it that matters. And there are a range of things that I think that if we can demonstrate in our day-to-day interactions with parents, if we can demonstrate them reliably and routinely, then we are demonstrating a collaborative style. I think the marker of a collaborative practitioner is curiosity. A collaborative practitioner is always interested, in fact intrigued, about what a parent's idea is, what their view is, and how they got to that point. They tend to suspend judgment. They tend to not get into debates or arguments. What they do is they show intense interest in how it is that the parent has got to the point at where they are and why it is that they think in the way they do and what indeed they do think. The collaborative practitioner is also frequently demonstrating warmth. It's very difficult to feel safe in a relationship if you are treated in a cold and hostile way. I guess that's saying the obvious. The collaborative practitioner is always exuding warmth and acceptance. The collaborative practitioner is always genuine. They're true to their word, they do what they say they're going to do. They also speak openly and honestly to the person they're working with. And of course, the collaborative practitioner is always respectful. And by that we mean they always go that little bit of extra mile to ensure that they understand what a person's underlying values and beliefs are, and what is driving those values and beliefs. And starting from the point of view that your values and beliefs are our starting point, and we need to know what they are, we need to identify them, and we need to appreciate them before we can move forward. The collaborative practitioner is always accepting. Acceptance is the lifeblood of human relationships. Without acceptance, it's hard to be comfortable in a relationship. Acceptance is about showing a determined commitment to understand again where a person's coming from. It's not always about agreeing with what somebody's saying, but it is always about working to understand why somebody is saying what they're saying. And finally, the collaborative practitioner is always very deliberate in their actions. The collaborative practitioner is very conscious of the effect their behaviour can have on somebody else, particularly the effect of a professional's behaviour on a parent. And so they are very careful in what they do and they say, what they do and say. In fact, the best practitioners in any interaction are almost always balancing up two things. They're trying to balance up, is the parent understanding me? Am I clear? Am I getting through? And how many am I clear? Am I getting through? And how is my relationship going? How is this interaction affecting the strength of my relationship? So they're monitoring both understanding and the quality of the relationship, and they're making adjustments as they go in order to preserve or protect that relationship. So there's a number of kind of, I guess, features or characteristics which we think are important to a collaborative style. In terms of a collaborative skill set, well, the most important skill that you have in your toolkit for collaboration, of course, is good listening. And good listening is the foundation for effectively working with, well, anybody, let alone parents. You know, it can be very valuable brushing up on your listening and communication skills, and there are courses around on how to do that, and I do recommend them. But I think learning communication skills is a lifelong task. Even though we do it every day, listening, it is always something that we can enhance, improve, and make better. We don't have time today to go into detail around listening, so I just wanted to leave you this one tip, and that is, if you are really genuinely trying to understand somebody when they're talking to you, then it's highly likely that you are really listening rather than just hearing. And a good sign that you're doing that is that you are so focused on what the other person is saying that you're not in your head thinking about what you're going to say next. If you're in your head thinking about what you're going to say next, then it's possible that you are not genuinely listening in that time and in that moment to what the person is saying to you. So I think that's not a bad little indicator of how you're going and whether or not you are effectively listening. All right. So in a way, what we've been covering is some of the foundations of collaboratively working with a parent. We've talked about some of the assumptions that we bring to the table that make it, I guess, equip us to be able to work collaboratively. And then there's a sort of a number of aspects of the way we behave towards people, which will either strengthen the potential for collaboration or weaken it in their absence. What I thought I would do now in the remainder of this webinar is to take some of those ideas but apply them to the issue of collaborative conversations. And by collaborative conversations, I'm talking about strategies for both responding to parents or initiating topics or discussions with parents where you may have concerns, for example. And so I thought what we might do is take a little bit of time to work our way through some examples of what a collaborative conversation could actually look like. But before we do that, I just wanted to alert you to something about the psychology of parenting and parental help seeking. I know this is a kind of a slightly weird slide, but it's the best I could find to illustrate the concept of vulnerability. I think when you're an educator and you've got a number of children in the room that you're responsible for, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that as far as parents are concerned, there's only one person in that room, and that's their child. It can also be easy to lose sight of the fact that parents are very vulnerable to perceived threats to their child's developmental well-being. And this really begins from the moment that a person has a baby. They become very aware that their own well-being, their own sense of emotional equilibrium is now very tightly connected to this little person. And any indication or suggestion that a child has a problem is obviously very anxiety-provoking to parents, very threatening to parents. And very soon after becoming a parent, not only does the parent become aware of that vulnerability, they also become aware of another aspect of vulnerability, and that is their own self-esteem. And in fact, it's very hard to feel good about yourself as a parent, as a person, and feel really bad about the job you're doing as a parent. Now, by the way, most parents are overly self-critical. But if you're really down on yourself as a parent, then it is very, very hard to have a reasonable self-esteem. And so for parents, when a person approaches them, for example, with a concern, there is a real threat here. There's a threat to A, there could be something wrong with my child, or B, there could be something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not doing a good job. And in our society, the suggestion that I'm not doing a good job as a parent is a potentially very threatening scenario. And again, here's another kind of funny slide, but one of these dogs represents an early childhood educator. I wonder which one that is. Maybe you might have some comments you'd like to make in the chat room about that. I think the answer to this question is it depends on the day. But I think it is worth keeping in mind when we're approaching a parent with a potential concern, emotionally it might feel a little bit like this Cocker Spaniel, that in fact what we are bringing to the table is something that is a real potential threat to the parent. And when we as human beings face a threat, then what happens is that we experience the fight-flight response. I'm sure you're familiar with that idea of fight-flight response. It's what happens when, as human beings, we're exposed to something that we judge to be threatening in some way. We either are prepared physically and mentally to fight the issue, or we're prepared physically and mentally to run away. And of course, this worked really well back in the early days of evolution. If we were walking through the jungle and came face to face with a saber-toothed tiger, our fight-flight response would kick in. Our adrenaline will be released. We would be activated to either fight that saber-toothed tiger or to try and climb a tree as quickly as we can. And this basic response is still obvious in human beings today. And so particularly when we have to raise issues that can be of concern to a parent, we are potentially raising something that could trigger a fight-flight response. And sometimes when you think about the way parents respond, you can see that fight-flight response in action. For example, the parent kind of saying, oh, no, he's going to be okay as she makes for the door, is potentially in a flight response. The parent who shapes up and questions your judgment and asks you whether or not you're a parent and what would you know and so on is electing the fight response. But either way, what we're seeing is anxiety driving the response. So what is important in having effective constructive conversations with parents is that we need to not trigger fight-flight. We need to help parents feel safe in the conversation. We need to approach things in their own time and make their own decisions and come to their own judgments and not scare them off too quickly. All right. Now, you have lots of interactions with parents every day, and not every one of these will be a constructive conversation. I'm here talking about those important conversations, ones that need a little bit more time than just a quick conversation at the door. Sometimes, though, it'll be at pick-up time or drop-off time that an issue gets raised, where a parent might, make an offhand comment about something, might complain about something, which could be an opportunity to be helpful to them. But maybe pick-up time or drop-off time won't be the time to do that. So we do have to consider our timing. There could be opportunities that you could take up where you might say, look, this is something that we might be able to talk about, mightn't it? Let's make a time to get together and have a quick chat. There might be some things that I can share with you that would help. But finding that time is often better than having an unproductive or unhelpful conversation that occurs in a rush of pick-up time. I mean, you guys don't have consulting rooms, do you? So you have to be thinking about how do you create space for these kinds of conversations. I mean, if you do have an office where you and the parent can escape to have a private conversation, that's ideal. But if you don't, then maybe you might have to choose a part of the room which is a little less busy. Or you might even have to use your own body or positioning in the room to create a kind of sense of personal space, or to create a little bit of space, or a little bit of privacy to have a conversation with a parent. It can also be useful, particularly before having a tricky conversation with the parent, to take some time to get perspective. If you know you've got a tricky conversation coming with a parent, why not talk to a colleague? Float with them what your concern is. Maybe even suggest to them how you might go about even dealing with that. How would you tackle that issue? And get their perspective on it, because getting their feedback could be a good way for preparing yourself for the conversation. And that leads me to my final point here about collaborative conversations. I think where you can, and you can't always, because sometimes they just happen without planning, but where you can prepare for a conversation is worthwhile doing that, particularly having something that you're going to say to start the conversation off. Doing some preparation will stand you in good stead for having a conversation that is tricky or potentially difficult. So what I thought we might do is have a look at two scenarios, and I'm going to go through these reasonably quickly. I just wanted to assure you that we'll provide these handouts to you after the webinar, so you'll be able to spend a little bit more time going into the detail. But I wanted to take you through two scenarios. The first is when the parent approaches you and is looking for your input or has a concern, and the second is when you need to approach a parent, maybe because you have a concern. So let's first begin with the parent approaching you. Here's an overarching strategy that we can use, and as I said, we can provide this as a handout afterwards, but I just thought we would just walk through, fairly briskly walk through a series of steps in helping a parent. Okay, so assuming the parent has initiated some interaction with us or asking us a question, maybe it's a parent who's been thinking out aloud about whether or not she should begin toilet training, for example. Okay, so the first thing that we do, as we've just alluded to, is create a little bit of space, because this conversation will need a little bit more space and time than just a one-off brief couple of sentences. So we need to create space in the way I've just talked about. Our next job is to listen. And we've emphasised how important listening is, but here what we're trying to do is listen to understand what it is the parent is concerned about, and what you're trying to get at is a sense of the topic or the issue. What is the thing of concern, but also how are they feeling about that? You want to get a sense of both of these things. What are they thinking and how are they feeling? A particularly good way of getting to the bottom of something is to ask the parent to clarify by providing an example of the last time it happened. For example, if the parent was talking about toileting, you might ask them and say maybe the parent has indicated that she's thinking she's seeing signs that the child might be ready for toilet training. You might ask the parent to give you an example of one of those signs. What does it actually look like? For example, fewer wet nappies, or perhaps the child is showing an interest in the toilet, and so on. It can be quite difficult for parents to describe in detail what's happening, and often they'll be talking in general terms. We need to get beyond general terms and get to the specifics, and asking for an actual example of something is a really helpful way to get parents to give you specifics or details. Now what you do next depends on whether you've got a good shared understanding. If you don't really understand, and you can check this out by asking, but if you don't understand, that's back to listening. But if you do understand, you feel like you've got an understanding where the parent's at, you're ready to move on to the next step. Oh, I could have used those arrows, couldn't I? All right, the next step, and I think a really important one, is to affirm and validate. And what this means is that you want to fairly quickly reinforce the parent for approaching you about this. And one really useful way of doing that is affirming their efforts and validating their concern. One trap to avoid is to simply rush to normalising something. Even if, for example, temper tantrums are very common in 2- and 3-year-old children, that doesn't mean they're not difficult to handle. So it's important to not appear to brush it off by emphasising how normal or how typical temper tantrums are, but more to validate how challenging that they are to deal with. So you might even say something like, yes, aren't temper tantrums really challenging to handle? They can really get on your nerves, can't they? You might also be able to affirm the parent's help seeking by saying something like, you're not the first parent to raise this issue with me. In fact, you're the second parent this week who's talked to me about temper tantrums. What you're really doing there is both sharing this idea that this is not an atypical kind of problem, but you're also validating the fact that it can be challenging and that it is worthwhile talking about. Next, share your observations. And this is important about when and how you share observations. First, be clear about what the parent is saying, then affirm and validate, then share what you have observed. For example, you might have noticed something in the room that is useful to share. When you share your observations with a parent, It's important to share observations that are consistent with the parent's view first. So don't jump to something like, oh, we never see temper tantrums here. You can imagine how a parent feels when they hear that. But more go to things that do support what the parent's saying. So, for example, you might not have seen a temper tantrum in the room, but you might be able to see, for example, at times where the child is getting frustrated. For example, when a child takes a toy away from them, or when they can't get immediately to something that they really want. And sharing your observation there can help validate where the parent's at, not invalidate them, but also begins to build the parent's view. After you've shared observations which are consistent with the parent's view, then feel free to share observations which are not so consistent with that view, but what you're doing is you're taking them on a journey, helping them move with you rather than directly contradicting them. Here's another important thing with help seeking. Just because somebody's complaining about something doesn't mean they're asking for help. Sometimes they just want to get something off their chest. So always clarify what the parent is seeking by asking. And you can ask very simply, what was it you were hoping to achieve by talking to me? What was it you were looking for here? Make sure you never proceed with advice or never give advice until you've been given permission to. And you might do that by offering to work with them or offering to share information with them, but don't do that before you've got their permission. And you will know what it's like in your own life when somebody offers you advice that you have not asked for and you're not ready for. And so we can avoid that problem by being always very careful to get permission before we give advice. Now, if the parent agrees that they'd like to work with you, then you've got a little project now to work on. If they don't agree, then always leave the door open. You can say something to them like, well, if it ever does become more of a concern to you, or if you're ever looking for other ideas, why don't you come and speak to me? My door is always open. If the parent is willing to work with you, then this is the point where we can begin to share ideas and resources and begin to help the parent put together a plan. Make sure that even in doing that, though, you prompt the parent to come back to you if those ideas or those resources are not helpful, because there's always something more that can be done. There's always somebody else who could be helpful if we get to the point where we exhaust all the ideas that we have together. We always want to convey to the parent there is always something more that can be done. We don't want them sort of walking away thinking, well, that's it, there's nothing more I can do. So prompt further help seeking. And finally, follow up. Why not just check in a few weeks later to see how they're going with that situation and check whether or not things are working for them or whether or not they might actually benefit from some additional help. Okay, so you're probably saying, Warren, that's all very fine. Here the parent wants help, but what about when the parent is not concerned about something and I am? So what I'm going to do is just take you through a strategy for when you need to raise a concern with a parent. And then I'll stop there and then we can look at any questions that might have come up. This is a particularly tricky issue, raising a concern with a parent, because as you can imagine, this is potentially a threat to your relationship and the strength of your relationship. Nobody likes to hear bad news. Nobody likes to hear things that maybe they should be concerned about. So the way we handle this is really very crucial. And maybe just to illustrate an example, I thought I might use an example that I often use in this situation, which is something that actually happened to us when our children, our twins, were in kindergarten. And I'll just tell you quickly what happened, and then we can walk through the way the teacher might have handled it slightly differently. So one term in to 4-year-old kinder, the kindergarten teacher, who was very new to the kinder, came up to my wife, and her opening line was, I think we should hold the twins back this year. In other words, she was suggesting that the twins repeat kinder. And that did not go down well with my wife. She had quite a negative reaction to that. The conversation wasn't very productive. I know that she didn't talk to the kindergarten teacher much again after that. But what I also know is that all the way through primary school, we used to have conversations at home about whether or not we should have kept the children back, whether or not they were too young to start. And it just occurs to me that there was an opportunity for a conversation that could have had a different outcome, but it didn't go well. And even though the teacher was really well-intentioned, the way it happened meant that it kind of fell apart very, very early. So let's have a look at an alternative way that the educator could have handled this scenario. First, as in the first one, create a little bit of space. And one of the important things about a tricky conversation is that it's not the first conversation you have with a parent. So developing a relationship through some positive interactions, even if they're quite brief, is a good, I guess, grounding for the more tricky conversation. That's not always possible, but where you can, make sure the tricky conversation is not your first. Second, assume responsibility for the issue. What I mean by that is at this point, it's not the parent's problem, it's the educator's problem. The parent is not reporting a problem, the educator is the one who's concerned, so take responsibility for that. So this teacher could have said something like, I've got a little bit of a dilemma that I'm facing at the moment with the twins. And I wondered whether I could have a quick word to you about that, because I'd really like your input or your ideas about what might be happening. Have you got a moment to talk to me about it? And here, what you're doing is you're taking responsibility for the situation. You're saying to the parent, this is my thing, this is not yours. And that automatically takes a bit of pressure off the parent. Next, use observational language to describe the issue. Here what we want to do is avoid interpretation. We want to avoid generalizations that could provoke resistance or defensiveness on the part of the parent. What the teacher I talked about did, her mistake was that she went with a solution to a problem the parent did not understand. She had no clue about why the teacher was suggesting we hold the twins back. So instead, what the teacher could have done is said something like, what I notice at the beginning of every kinder session is when the twins come into the room, they'll stand and just look at the other kids playing. They'll wander from table to table, but they'll take 10 to 15 minutes before they'll settle down into an activity with other children. And as you'll notice from that description I've just used, what I've done is just describe what I have seen. I've not made any interpretations. I haven't said, I think your children have got social issues, or they haven't even used the word shy. I simply described what's happening. It's difficult to resist an observation of something which is just simply a fact. All right. Next, seek the parent's observations. Have they seen it? The teacher could have asked my wife. She could have said, well, have you noticed this? This is an opportunity to collect very useful information from the parent and get an understanding about whether the parent has noticed or observed these same things. So in this case, my wife might have said something like, yeah, well, definitely, whenever I take them to situations where they're unfamiliar or unsure, yeah, they're very shy. They tend to hold onto my legs. It takes forever for me to encourage them to play with other children. They really are quite shy. But when it comes to their cousins who live next door, they're playing with them all the time. And they're quite happy to go over there and play, and they don't take any time at all to warm up. Now that would have been valuable information for the kindergarten teacher to actually receive. That tells us a lot about what the issue might be. But also it creates a shared foundation. We're now talking about the same thing. The next thing to do is explore whether the parent is in fact concerned. We might ask the parent like, oh, so what do you think about that? How do you feel about that? You might even say, well, are you concerned about that? What we're looking to do is find a shared understanding about whether this is something that is worthy of focus. Now, what we do next will depend on whether the parent is concerned. If the parent shares our concern, then we can invite them to work with us. And if they agree, then we're into the helping mode, just like we talked about earlier. So we can look at sharing ideas and resources and so on. If the parent does not agree, then our next step really is to explore why the parent is not concerned. This is useful. It's more information gathering, but it also encourages the parent to think through why they're not concerned. So, for example, the teacher could have asked my wife, "Oh, okay." If she wasn't concerned, she could have asked my wife, "So, okay, so why aren't you concerned?" And I don't know, Denise might have said something like, "Oh, well, You know, they're just like their father. He was shy once, but now have a look at him. He's completely incorrigible now. You can't tie him down, or something like that. I'm sure they'll grow out of it, she might say. Now, depending on the explanation will determine what you do next. You might actually be convinced by the parent's explanation, and you might go, fine, well, that's great. I'm glad we had this conversation, and look forward to seeing you next time. We don't go any further. But you might still have grounds for concern. And there will be times when, as a professional, you, and having the best interest of the child at heart, you need to push a little bit harder than just what is given to you on the surface. And it's not useful at this point to confront the parent, but what it can be useful at this point is to ask questions that help the parent think about things, particularly think about the future. So a really useful question to explore is there a time when the parent might become concerned? And would they be interested in preventing that from eventuating? So imagine my wife is not concerned. The teacher might say to her something like, well, what do you think about, towards the end of, the year, if they were still like this and about ready to go to school, would you be concerned then? And you might just find the parent says, yeah, I guess if they were, still really shy and reluctant to join in at school, they'd find school quite stressful, wouldn't they? And if the parent agreed with that, then there's an opening for us to extend that invitation again. Would they be interested in preventing that from actually happening? In this case, we're sort of giving the parent a really, I think, useful choice. They don't have to admit that there's something wrong, and I'm using inverted commas here, but they can or might be interested in making sure that what's happening now sort of doesn't get worse or doesn't continue on into the future. Failing that, you might invite the parent to help you with your problem. You might say to them something like, okay, well, it sounds like you're very comfortable with what's happening and you're very confident that they're going to grow out of this. But I still have this dilemma, and I was thinking that maybe if you and I got our heads together, you might be able to give me some advice about how best to handle this. And what we're doing now is we're inviting the parent to join us as a consultant. And that gives the parent opportunity to work with us. It also buys time, because there might be a point in the future where the parent is willing to look at a particular issue with us together and to think about how this is happening for them at home, not just what's happening at the centre. But look, if all that fails and you've done your best, then still keep the door open. Just saying something to the parent like, okay, well, if the situation ever changes and you ever do become concerned about this, my door is always open. And this is really useful because if a parent's been treated with respect and kindness and acceptance, then sometimes they'll go away and they'll think about it. And after they've thought about it, they'll think, you know what, I can talk to that person. Or if it's not you, it might make it more likely that in the future they'll talk to somebody else. So what you've done is done some really good groundwork into the future. Okay, cool. I've probably just talked your heads off there, but let's just stop there in terms of our content and see whether or not we have some questions we can deal with in the last few minutes of our time together. Just while you're thinking about questions, and if you want to add them to our chat room, so I want to alert you to a really useful resource that you've got in working with parents. And that's the Raising Children Network website, a source of evidence-based, reliable information. It's a virtual encyclopedia of parenting issues and a great resource that you can take parents to, either direct them to, or even sit with them next to them and explore the material together to help find ideas or strategies or solutions that they might find useful. Okay, so we have one question. I'll just let's come back here and get on screen. We have one question. This is from Narelle. The question: is it possible to teach people to be collaborative, respectful, have good communication, etc.? As we know, this makes a difference in working with families. And should it be inherent in all training? I think that there are certainly things that we can learn in training. And if you think about a lot of the training that educators get, there's very little preparation for working with parents, isn't there? A lot of training is focused on how you create learning environments for children, and not a lot of time is spent on how you work with their parents. And I think that means a lot of educators do feel a little unprepared for dealing with parents on the first day on the job. So I think there are things that could be done in training to better equip educators so that they have some skills, they have some strategies up their sleeve for when they start work. Having said that, I also think that these skills probably do need to be learned on the job. I think it's difficult to learn the skills without actually working with parents. It's a bit like very difficult to learn relationship skills without being in a relationship, or learn parenting skills without having children. I think that these skills are learned on the job. So I think what we have to do is provide ways of helping educators develop their skills through on-the-job experiences and being exposed to useful resources. It's through good input on the job that I think parents, that educators may well learn the best. Okay, would you use the same set of skills? I'm not sure exactly what that question is, Hayley, but one thing I would emphasise is, oh yes, sorry, I just read half the question. Would you use the same set of skills when dealing with grandparents? Now, Hayley, I'm just going to riff off this question just a little bit to make another point, which I think might be useful. When it comes to relationships, if you think about human relationships, the same set of skills apply in almost all relationships. So the skills that you as an educator use when you're building relationships with children are very similar to the skills that you would use in building a relationship with a parent or a carer. For example, tuning in, being responsive, warmth and acceptance, following the other person's lead. They're all important strategies for building relationships that are important not only for educator-child relationships, but also useful in educator-parent relationships. And so I'd encourage you to think about that we are really applying the same set of skills into a different context. Are these skills useful in terms of your relationships with other carers, for example, grandparents? Well, I think they are. I think they are foundational skills. I think it's worth keeping in mind that that grandparents are different from parents in the sense that they often don't have the same decision-making responsibility of parents, and they sometimes can't make the kinds of decisions that we call upon parents to make. But the reality is that you'll be working with grandparents, and there's no reason why this approach could not as equally work effectively with grandparents as well. And Hayley says she's nodding to that, which is a relief. That's really good. Okay, all right, folks. Is there anything I've missed here, Kim? Have we exhausted you and nearly ran out of time? So maybe perhaps let's just finish just with a couple of little bits of information that you might find useful. I've talked about the Raising Children Network. This is a resource that I'd encourage you to use. There are others as well, but at least this is an Australian parenting information website. You can have some confidence in the material. There is one more webinar that we're doing as part of this series for the Centre of Parenting Excellence, and that is on the 2nd of August at 1 p.m. This is looking at the challenge of adult behaviour change and parenting support. I would want to say that I will have more intensive services in mind doing this. So I've got in mind services and organisations that work with families in more intensive ways, like family support services or early childhood intervention programs, rather than universal educational type services. But if that interests you, then you're more than welcome to come along. Finally, if you're interested in the work of the Parenting Research Centre, There's a number of ways you can stay in touch. We have a quarterly newsletter you can sign up for by visiting our website. You can follow us on Twitter, or you can find us on LinkedIn. So we would love you to stay in touch in that way. Okay, Narelle and we will make sure that you guys get access to a copy of the presentation. You'll also at some point be able to access a link to the presentation if you want to view it again or you want to share it with colleagues. Thank you very, very much for participating. And if you could take a moment to complete our evaluation online, I think it'll only take 2 or 3 minutes, and that would be really fantastic. Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you another time.